Hello again. You've arrived at just the right time. Wherever you've come from, whatever your day has carried, you can leave it behind now. There's nothing else you need to do. Only breathe, listen, and let yourself drift. Tonight, along the creaking paths of memory and time, just as travelers once did beneath the shadow of the Mongol Empire so vast that its boundaries blurred, swallowed by horizon and wind, across dusty continents and forgotten cities, and silence, broken only by the thudding of hooves. They called it the Pax. It meant movement, regulation, laws without mercy, and rulers who once carved their paths from Beijing to Baghdad. The sound of a cart wobbling across dry land, a space of quiet authority, a camel sighing as it's roused before dawn, a yurt collapsing under careful hands. For the next few hours, we'll walk beside the traders, warriors, but as a man haunted by visions, shaped by betrayal, from Samarkand to the edge of Europe, and the cities that rose and fell to serve them. We'll begin with the caravan's dust. From there, we turn to the strange and somber life of Genghis Khan himself, not as the invader you may know. Then we'll chart the great routes across the continent, the invisible arteries that carried silk, glass, stories, and coins. Later still, we'll step quietly into the Khan's personal tent. There is no rush. Each step will take us deeper into stillness. You do not need to remember it all. Let your mind drift, float, and if it wishes, wander. History doesn't ask that we stay awake, that somewhere long ago there were people who lived and labored beneath the same sky. Though their feet blistered across ancient soils, though their days were long and their food was cold, they moved forward always. Forward through the dust and the quiet certainty that the road had no end. Now, close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the present melt into the past and prepare to walk the long, slow, sun-bleached path of the first of our stories, a tale of fermented horse milk. Why it really did suck to be in a Mongol caravan. The sun hasn't yet risen. The sky is still a cold grey blue. Beneath it, the caravan stirs slowly to life. Your breath curls from your lips in faint clouds. Beneath you, the wool blanket that kept you warm through the night is stiff at the corners, soaked with dew. It doesn't scream. Instead, it whispers a low breath through the grasses, a cracked gourd filled with fermented mare's milk. Sharp on the tongue, you drink it quickly. A lump of dried curd follows her. It does not fill you, carrying sand that stings the skin and finds the corners of your eyes. Already you feel it creeping into your socks, at least at a checkpoint, or a child playing with a carved stick. Something human, even if fleeting. Animals kneel. There is no fighting the storm, only waiting. When it passes, your tongue will feel like clay, and still you'll walk again. First, a haze in the air, then a deepening of the light, a rainbow in the spray of a rare stream. How far there is still to go. And you pull your scarf tighter, and you walk. The glint of a brass teapot against the sun, the curve of a woman's braid, a lullaby hummed in a language you don't know, sung to a baby whose eyes have only ever known dust. You tie a cloth over your nose, pull your hood tight, The sky turns colorless. The air becomes thick, as if you are breathing through linen, or more. You're not certain anymore, because today, a day of counting your footsteps, until the sun disappears again. Vision narrows. Traders from different corners of the empire, they carry silks, yes, but also salt, tea, copper mirrors, medicinal powders, cheap lacquerware, or at least the version you've imagined. A place with running water, with stone buildings and canopies of woven shade, that the man beside you has also slept beside grunting camels, has also wondered if the city at the end of the road is worth the pain of getting there. And a bed. One man even claims to have a jar of snow from the mountains. It's the accumulation of small discomforts. A boot that rubs, a splinter in the palm, the way your knees ache when you squat to relieve yourself on rocky soil, across rivers bridged only by stone and fear. The caravan moves slowly, but it moves. The way the wind always finds the hole in your coat. The way the tea tastes like smoke. The way you sometimes wake unsure of what day it is. Sealed with beeswax, once, 2 weeks ago. Not because they are unfriendly. Words disappear, and there are few things to say after weeks of sand and sameness. Now and then, someone hums a tune, quiet, repetitive, a sudden outpost for poles, a cloth banner, an official with a stamped ledger and a bone pen. He asks questions. You barely understand. No receipts are given. You are permitted to pass. A song passed down from their grandfather's grandfather, its meaning long forgotten, but the rhythm enduring. You still think of it. You eat quickly, then wrap yourself in whatever cloth you have. Sleep comes fast, but not deeply. Lice itch. You scratch, carefully, so as not to disturb the others. Everyone has lice. No one mentions it. Slipping down the back of your collar, grinding into the wax seams of your boots. You will not be clean again for weeks, maybe longer. Your shoulder aches from sleeping against a sack of dried millet. The smell of warm dung and dry wool thickens. The animals grumble. Camels, mostly broad-lipped, sleepy-eyed creatures that smell faintly of old milk and stubbornness. They shift their weight slowly. You do not want to move, but you all do, together, because you must. There is no time to stretch, only the slow, quiet movements of life on the road. Not with urgency. Somewhere, a bundle of firewood crackles to life, making its way westward across the desert basins of Central Asia. But don't be fooled by the romance of that image. There is no silk fluttering in the wind, no exotic dancers, no opium smoke curling from golden pipes. There is only dust and distance. No matter how far you walk, the landscape will remain the same. The first kettle of the day is set on the flame, the water inside, sloshing sluggishly. You are cold. This is a Mongol caravan. As the sun rises, so too does the heat. It's not sharp. Not at first. It begins like a headache behind the eyes. The food is passed around with little ceremony. Occasionally there are treats. A sliver of dried mutton, greasy and tough. The caravan is not a single unit. It snakes across the stepping. People do not talk much. At night, they gather loosely. Fires are built low to avoid drawing attention. Occasionally, a checkpoint appears. These moments, strange as they are better than the open road. And then, the road stretches again. Sandstorms are not rare. They do not descend with drama. Wagons stop. What makes this life hardest isn't violence. You think of Baghdad, but Baghdad is still a month away. And still, there is something quiet beneath the suffering. A rhythm, a shared fatigue. You pass through valleys where nothing grows, along cliffs where hawks circle. And sometimes, you see something beautiful, and in those moments, you forget briefly how much it all hurts, how much it itches. It's time to move again. In a Mongol caravan, the day presses forward. The sun now hangs high overhead, pale and bleached in a sky without cloud. It offers no comfort. It often arrived slowly first, as a distraction, then a dull ache, and eventually as a kind of background hum. Rarely did anyone grow truly full. You didn't eat for satisfaction. You ate for survival, and the meals reflected that. Strips of dried intestines, boiled eggs, long since grey, bits of bone, with no meat left, but still sucked for flavour. Tea, brewed strong and salty. It warms you. Yes, only sometimes mould appears at the corners, faint green threads curling outward. If it smells sweet, it's tossed. If not, it's eaten. There is no shade. Mostly food is texture. A whistle sounds. The animals are stirred once more. The fires are stamped out. And you, stomach settled with sour milk and hard cheese, stand once more to face the road. Food is patience. Food is salt and vinegar and dry powder at the back of your throat. When a wheel breaks and the delay costs you a day's journey, when the spring you hoped for has dried, when a sack of flour is found infested with beetles, their bodies tiny and dry, then you ration, then you chew more slowly, then you measure each sip with your life in mind. A soft peach, a fresh fig, a handful of almonds, these are things one dreams of, not expects. Often cloudy, drawn from shallow wells or streams that smell faintly of iron or animal. It is stored in skins that taste of smoke and sweat. Sometimes it sloshes warm, sometimes cool, always faintly earthy. You learn not to care. You drink because your body needs it, not because it's pleasant. You once traded a silver pin for a handful of raisins in a market town near Bukhara. They were sweet, sticky. You savored them slowly, hiding them from the others. They were gone too soon. You eat because not eating is worse. You chew because stopping would mean falling behind. Food becomes less a pleasure and more a task, a chore, a quiet endurance of flavors you no longer notice. This is the moment to eat, if you can. You untie a cloth bundle, the edges of it stiff with grime and salt. Inside is the same as yesterday and the day before. A chunk of dried curd, hard white. You bite into it, and it resists your teeth with the stubbornness of stone. Eventually, it begins to soften. Its flavor is sharp, sour. A stranger offers you a slice of goat cheese. Someone unpacks a preserved apricot from a clay jar, and its scent alone makes you close your eyes. Once, an old man pulls a date from his pouch and insists you take it. Just one. The skin is wrinkled. You bite into it, and for just a second, everything else falls away. It coats the tongue in a powdery residue. You chew it slowly. Shadows are short and sharp, and the road ahead seems to ripple slightly in the heat. The caravan is quieter now. Conversation has thinned even further. Irag. It has an unmistakable bite, sour, fizzy, and warm from the sun, a drink that has no counterpart in the modern world. You sip carefully. It tastes like someone poured vinegar into yogurt, then left it to sit for a day too long. Still, it fills the stomach. It even lifts your spirits, briefly dried out by the thirst that comes when you've been chewing the same dry biscuit for hours, your mouth already robbed of moisture by the wind. Meat, when it was available, had been smoked until black or salted until leathery. A piece of dried mutton torn from a shared pouch is handed to you now. You tear into it slowly, gnawing more than biting. It takes time to chew. Your jaw aches from the effort, but again, it keeps you moving. That's what matters. Someone up ahead adjusts a strap. Hunger on the Silk Road didn't always come as a pang. Now, imagine yourself stopping beside a low hill. The caravan, having paused for midday rest. Beside you, someone drinks from a leather flask. The smell is instantly recognizable. Other days bring stranger things. Bread, when it appears, is dry and brittle, often packed days or weeks in advance. Vegetables are nearly. Water, too, tells its own story. It is rarely clear. The worst is when supplies run low, and yet there are moments, strange, fleeting moments when something unexpected happens. But those are rare gifts. Now the break is ending. The taste still lingers. It always does. They say that travel teaches you about people, and perhaps it does. But what they forget to mention is that when you travel in a caravan, there is no escape from people. Not in the morning when you first open your eyes, not in the cold, not while you eat, not while you walk, not while you relieve yourself behind the same sparse bush as a dozen others. You are never alone. Not really. Step away from the caravan and you risk being lost. When you stop to tie a sandal, when you weep quietly because your ankle is bleeding, or your ration was stolen, or you miss someone whose face you're forgetting, no one interrupts, but they hear. They always hear. Stray too far, even at night, breathing near you, shifting beside you, talking in their dreams, crying softly when they think no one listens. They are tiny, near invisible, but their presence is constant. You scratch, but never enough. You bathe when you can, but they return, as sure as dust, as sure as the road itself. The old woman who nodded at you when your eyes were too tired to speak, about a day without voices or smells, or the constant presence of others. You imagine a field with no path, a sky with no trail. You sleep when they sleep, even if their breathing keeps you awake. A moment where you sit alone and hear only the wind. When the fires have gone low and the animals are still, you look out across the sleeping bodies, the pair who always walk together, whispering, casting, looks back at the weaker members. You know better than to trust them, and you avoid them when you can. The guard who whispered, "Watch your step," before the rocky pass. The boy who, without asking, handed you a strip of cloth when your nose bled from the altitude. These are not bonds built with words. They are built with gestures, with glances, with space given or taken at the right time. There is always someone nearby, or a deal is cheated. But mostly, the tension simmers quietly, like a fire just beneath the ashes. You learn to live with it. You learn not to notice. Moving, watching, making noise, saying nothing. The oxen plod in dull silence, their tails twitching at invisible flies. The dogs bark too often at too little, and yet you miss them when they are not there. You listen for them at night. The caravan is its own strange village, shifting endlessly but never quiet. It moves through mountains and deserts and empty plains, and yet inside it, within the lines of carts and the knots of pack animals, it is crowded. Smells of sweat and sour cloth, the quiet clatter of pots being tied down, the whisper of private arguments in languages you don't speak, and everywhere, always, the shuffling of feet. You might walk beside the same people for weeks, yet never know their names, or you might hear a name once and then forget it. By sunset, some travelers are hired guards, others are drivers, because, to the caravan, you are one footstep among thousands. You are another voice, murmuring into the wind, more interested in their animals than in anything human. And then there are the merchants, the ones who own the goods and pay the guards. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. The way the man beside you chews with his mouth open, the woman who sings under her breath, the child who throws stones at nothing, the trader who always walks too close, the elder who clears his throat with great ceremony every 15 minutes, the girl who sharpens her knife against a rock for reasons no one asks, who sleep with silver near their skin and speak in clipped, practical phrases. You are none of these things, or perhaps you are. It doesn't matter. And yet, despite the anonymity, the friction is constant. Sometimes, you long for solitude so badly your hands curl into fists. There is no privacy. When you eat, others see your hands. When you drink, they see your thirst. Arguments happen, though rarely with raised voices. Words are short. Anger is saved for when it matters, for when a horse is lost. And yet, within the discomfort, a kind of companionship grows. Not friendship, not quite, but something quieter, something shaped by shared hardship. The man who gave you a strip of meat when you'd run out. Still, some people never soften. The merchant with the greedy eyes, the guard with the cruel laugh. The animals, too, are companions you did not choose. The camels groan and spit and smell. And then there are the lice in your blankets. But the caravan moves, and you move with it, because to step away is to disappear. So you learn the rhythm of shared life. You pace yourself to the people around you. You eat, and over time, their presence becomes familiar, their habits expected. And in the quietest moments, at night, perhaps, not entirely, not anymore, the road bends gently. By now, the sun has begun, its long descent toward the western horizon. The heat remains, but its strength has softened. Shadows stretch longer, is little more than a crude archway built of rough-cut timber, leaning slightly to one side. A wooden tower nearby holds a bell, though no one seems interested in ringing it. There is a canvas tent to the left. 2 men in worn robes sit beside it, legs crossed, holding bowls of warm milk. They don't look up right away. The caravan waits, because that is what caravans do. The caravan is not broken, only paused. There is no panic. You know what comes next. Sometimes, something stranger, 2 needles, a length of wire, a carved comb, because arguing costs more than silver. It costs time. It costs safety. It costs favor. He had a golden seal from a court in the east, an emblem of his family's rights. He waved it in the air, demanded recognition, then calmly placed it in his own pouch. It depends on the mood of the collector, on how bored he is, on how many travelers have passed before you, on whether the moon is waxing or waning. The rules are unwritten, and their flexibility is their strength. It was supposed to let you pass freely to claim food and shelter, but not all Paysa were equal, and not all officials cared. Others demanded them even when they weren't required, at bridges, at passes, known only to the locals. A pair of sandals traded for directions. The caravan creaks forward once again. By the end of the journey, you will have paid more in tolls than in taxes. But the taxes are remembered. The tolls are forgotten, folded into the memory of the journey like pebbles in the soles of your boots. A shepherd appears on a hill. The laws were carved in stone. You know he expects payment for guiding you to a hidden spring. He offers to help you cross. You know the help isn't free, a price not just in coin, but in patience, in humility, in acceptance. The very existence of a system gave the illusion of order, but beneath it was the same soft chaos, a polished Paysa, and be ignored in the back roads of Transoxiana. Not rage, a broken cart, a family thin and silent, not because you must, not even surprise, just a hollow understanding. Even when the caravan has traveled these same roads before, even when the goods are the same, and the guards recognize your faces, laws written in harsh, it does not mean fairness, it does not mean dignity, and sometimes about power. His expression is unreadable, not unkind, not cruel, because the man in charge is napping, because the clouds have gathered, just tired. You do not see what's inside. You move forward. The bundle is placed near the tent, along with a dozen others. Your merchant answers in a different tongue. They go back and forth for a time. It is a familiar dance, slow and practiced. The animal steps slow, and the dust clings more closely to the skin, refusing to be brushed off. This, you've come to understand, is the most deceptive time of day, when the light grows gold and soft, and you begin to hope that rest is near. But just ahead, something interrupts the flow. A line of carts has stopped. Men are standing beside their animals. Another checkpoint. These are not grand gates, not walls of stone. This one, his belt holds a thin dagger. The revealing of ledgers, so few can read them. The merchant produces a sealed document, rolled tight and bound in ribbon. The seal is checked. A nod is given, but a pause follows. The official asks for a toll. No one is surprised. The fee is not large, at least not by the standards of empires. A silver coin, a length of cloth. You reach into your pack and offer a tin of powdered ginger. You do not argue. Once, weeks ago, you passed through a similar post near the edge of the Taklamakan. A younger man had protested the toll. The man paid double to be allowed through. You remember the look on his face. Sometimes the toll is taken without speaking. A guard points to a bundle. You hand it over. And sometimes the toll is your time. You may wait an hour or 5 or a day, not because anyone is checking anything, but because you are not important enough to be hurried because someone else is talking. The road was said to be safe under the Mongols, and in many ways it was. Bandits were fewer, way stations more frequent. The famous Peza, the Mongol passporter, stamped tablet of metal or wood granted certain rights to certain people. Some travelers forged them. Some officials didn't bother to look. And then there were the informal tolls. Not at checkpoints, not between flags or under towers. And sometimes it's the other way around. These small exchanges blur into the rhythm of the road. A handful of barley there. By the time your caravan is allowed to pass through this checkpoint, the sun has nearly touched the horizon. The guard does not say farewell. The wheels begin to turn, invisible, quiet, constant. To travel in the age of the Mongols was to walk in the space between power and dust. And so you walk, step by step, forward. The weight of another toll. Before he was the thunder that rolled across continents. Before the name Ganges carried weight in every language. He was simply a boy named. They lived in felt tents, not nomads, by romantic choice but by necessity. Staying in one place too long meant starvation or attack. With the sky, he remembered who had betrayed them. He remembered who gave help. He was not a boy of passion. Carefully, but each one only sharpened his sense of what power meant and what it could not rely on. Bloodline was fragile. Only loyalty endured, but accepted, recognized, and so the name began to spread. A man who rose not through inheritance, but through resilience, through a slow, patient accumulation of trust and fear. Not with force, forgiveness, where it was strategic, ruthlessness, where it was necessary. His early years were not filled with conquests. They were filled with alliances. But the sky was clear, the stars silent. In that stillness, he claimed a purpose. Not from gods, not from spirits, but from the land itself. He would unite the tribes not to rule them, but to stop their endless bleeding. They underestimated the silence between his actions. And so, eventually, he moved. For loyalty, for knowing that the grain would arrive, that the messengers would not lie, that justice, even if hard, would come. His armies struck with speed and coordination the Chinese had not imagined. Slowly, publicly. It was not a military insult. It was a personal one. And so he answered, his throne was the saddle, his hall, the tent, his power, not in jewels, but in fear and order. Quietly, there are many stories, none confirmed. A fall from a horse, a wound that festered. His body was carried to a secret grave. His guards, it said, killed all who saw them. And though the cities fell, his attention was elsewhere. Offers, law codes, census staking, diplomatic networks. He invited artisans to his camp, carried scholars with his army, allowed all religions so long as they paid tax, punished corruption with death, to bring silence to a region that had known only chaos. Most were accepted, quiet ones, methodical, quietly devastating, but those who served him called him something else. A man who remembered his roots, who never forgot the cold river, the empty yurt, the hunger that woke him at night. But even then, those that didn't were not, and oaths made not in public, but beneath the stars, with only the steppe as witness, not fully, but noticeably, of a world united not, a place where a woman could walk alone with gold in her hands and be untouched, a place where messages moved faster than rumors, where all men, high or low, could find their place in a code. The chaos began to dim. The clans who once fought over horses now shared in trade. Theft was punished. Betrayal ended quickly. Those who followed the rules were left in peace. But a boy of memory, his tent was simple, his voice low, but his will was firm. A village destroyed as message, a brother executed for disloyalty. The line between mercy and finality was clarimoned. No one crossed it twice. Of patterns, and over time, those patterns shaped something larger. Just a boy. The wind still blew, stealing cattle, taking women, burning camps, scattering children. He knew it well. He had lived it, and he had grown tired of it, but respected enough to command loyalty from a few households, enough to secure a marriage alliance when Temujin was 9. The boy was sent to live with his future bride's family. That was the way. He left, with only a small bundle and a memory of home. The grass still bent. His people were small, scattered. Temujin's family belonged to a small tribal group. His father was not powerful. It is easy to forget. Buried beneath the dust of conquests and the numbers of the fallen that Temujin later known as Genghis, he was not born with fire in his eyes or steel in his hands. He was born into a world of cold air and thin broth, of wind-whipped tents, and nights spent listening to wolves at the edge of the campfire's glow. He did not begin his life planning to rule. He began it trying to survive, alone, and he waited. The Mongols had no prophets, no temples of stone, to end the cycles that had left his family broken and wandering, to give structure to a people born in motion. He did not seek conquests, not yet. He sought stillness, a place where the same fire could burn 2 nights in a row, where alliances did not turn to ash by morning. Their gods rode with the clouds and spoke in the patterns of dust. The sky was sacred, but not separate. It was everywhere, within him, of rivers, of fire that did not burn. His followers claimed these dreams foretold greatness. He never said so. He treated them not as predictions, but as responsibilities around him. Something anchored to the world, even as he changed it. That the chaos he had suffered as a boy could not be allowed to continue. That if no one else would make order from the wind, families without protection, he spoke not of glory, but of order. He told them he would end the fighting, that he would bring justice, unmoving. And then, when the time came, absolute, another warlord, another name lost to the sand, that he would remember, in the fact that, for all his ambition, he remembered names, faces, debts, kindnesses, wrongs. He carried them like stones in his cloak. The rhythm of the world seemed to settle. He left the mountain not as a prophet. Temujin's trust in the sky was not separate from his rule. No generals, swearing oaths in blood, but it is the part that shaped the rest. He believed he had been chosen not in the sense of destiny, but in the sense of burden. The sky had placed a weight on his shoulders, and he would carry it, even when it made his path harder. But as a man who had chosen a direction, a man who had built something within himself that the wind could not steal, and on that mountain, but quietly, he would dismount, not to pray, but to remember, to place his hand on the same stone and feel beneath his palm. And yet, somewhere along that path across those cracked hills and frozen creeks, not all at once, a day, perhaps, or more, he had no tent, no food. They did not follow, they did not speak of it, but they watched, and they understood that their Kundo ruthless and strategic and pragmatic was only the clothes on his back and the breath in his lungs. But as the sky turned above him, who spoke of dreams not as metaphors, their rituals were simple, not loudly, not in a voice for others to hear, but in the voice one uses for something older. He made promises, he swore oaths, not to men, but to the eternal blue sky, not loudly, too broken. He had seen betrayal, his father poisoned, his mother dishonored, his allies turned strangers, his camp scattered. He was, at that moment, a boy without shelter, a man without kin. But, deeply, there was a moment, they say, high on the Birken Kaldon mountain, a sacred place among the Mongols, the kind of place where even silence felt old, where the stones seemed to hum with memory. Temujin walked slowly. It was a need, a last act of someone with no clear path forward, a place of stone and grass and sky, a place where men went not for conquests. It is said that Temujin climbed that mountain in his youth, alone, at a time when his world had become too loud. And so he climbed. The mountain was not tall in the way others are tall. It did not pierce the clouds or gleam with snow, but it was ancient. And when he reached the top where, no one knows how long he stayed there, it was not a conversion. He promised, not just for power, but for peace. The mountain did not speak back. Later, when he was older, when his name was whispered from Beijing to the Caspian, he would return to that mountain, his people noticed. In those early days, the line between the spiritual and the practical was thin. He kept shamans close, not many, but for guidance, men who read the wind who burned herbs in the corners of tents. He dreamed often. And when others came to him, tribes without leaders, and when he was betrayed, and he responded like the mountain. This is not the part of Genghis Khan's story that fills scrolls or battle maps. There are no grand speeches, no cities burning. Without the mountain, without the silence, without the wind, only another warrior. But Temujin, something rooted. He believed not that he was destined to rule, but that he was required to. He never said this aloud, but you can feel it in the rhythms of his laws. Imagine again the wide grasslands of Mongolia rippling beneath a low sky. There are no cities here, no castles. Before armies moved at his command, not in riches. His childhood was shaped by abandonment, his family cast out after his father's death. His youth, he understood what divided the tribes and older betrayals, tens. When one family faltered, the others fed their children. If one member of a unit fled in battle, if one shined, all shared in the reward. The right of revenge, so long a pillar of honor, was restricted. The taking of wives and livestock, the kidnapping of women between clans, once so common it barely raised comment, was now a crime, and crimes had consequences swift. Another for abusing a captive, but they were consistent, that chiefs, sons, and brothers would not be allowed to rise. Temujin knew the cost of leaving enemies behind. He had been one. Other tribal leaders, only if your rule was not just strong, but just. Their raids were timed. A man who had supported him early but grew arrogant was executed for insubordination. Another, who mocked a lower-born commander, was stripped of his title. Their conquests recorded, he demanded patience, where before they saw in his reforms not unity. He had stripped them of their power quietly at first, then completely. Their guards replaced, their warriors reassigned. He was building a system. A rebellion was not. A disagreement, it was a threat to the entire structure he had built, and threats were not tolerated. Their names no longer carried the weight they once had, mostly oral. A collection of principles, not pages, but it was understood. They acknowledged what had already become true. Theft was punished, lying to a commander, striking a fellow soldier. Those who stayed loyal were elevated often. His most trusted general, Subutai, was not of noble blood. Another, his wife. When he left the campaign, but for Temujin, if someone served the empire well, their gender or class was irrelevant. Nor was Jeeb, a former enemy who had once shot Temujin's horse from under him. Universal ruler, a man who had once shivered in a tent with no fire, now wrapped in the loyalty of 10,000 warriors and the weight of a dream held together not by blood, not self-bestowed, but granted by a council of the tribes, those who had accepted his rule, whether out of fear, gratitude, or exhaustion. When Jeeb surrendered and admitted his act, he made him a commander, each with a commander chosen for loyalty. This was not just military structure, it cut across clan loyalties, forced men to see each other, not as rivals, but as brothers in command. Generations of raiding, vengeance, horse, theft, marriage, revenge, and silence. It had always been this way. Young men, discarded by birth, former enemies who saw in him not just a leader, but a system. He offered something rare on the steppe. Stability, predictability. If you served him well, you would be rewarded, no matter who your father had been, and everyone believed it always would be. Just the long stretch of horizon, the shifting winds, and the nomadic clans, dozens of them, each with its own name, its own banner. Before Genghis Khan was a title, but Temujin, the man who would become Genghis, had watched the cost of this fracturing. He had lived it. It would not be tradition. It would not be name. It would not be fear alone. It would be loyalty. And for those at the bottom, a reason to follow. And so he began slowly, carefully to reshape the very structure of Mongol society. He gathered men not by blood, warriors who had once served other khans, or none at all. That was revolutionary. In a world where status clung to bloodlines, he divided his growing army into strict units, but by number. The army became a society of its own. It was equality of a brutal kind, but it worked. He also outlawed many of the petty tribal customs that kept people divided, and so, slowly, the steppe changed. There was resistance, of course. Some rebelled, and when they did, Temujin responded not with negotiation, but with finality. There was no room for half-loyalty. The stories are quiet, but clear. Whole families eliminated, not out of cruelty. This was not sentiment. It was strategy. A man who had once feared you could now be made to serve you more fiercely than any ally, but only if you gave him a reason. Temujin rewarded success with land. His warriors could not take what they pleased. Even the nobles who remained loyal were not spared scrutiny. Temujin was not building an empire of chance, and in the center of that system, he placed not himself, but the law. The yasa, his code, was still fluid in these years, but also respect. Women under his rule were given rights. They could own property, speak in councils. One of his most powerful advisors was his mother. In time, the title came. Genghis Khan. They gathered near the Anan River, where he had once played as a child. And there, among the grasses, and smoke, and murmured chants, but something new. And at the heart of it all, there is a sound the earth makes when the hooves stop, when the smoke settles, and the banners fall. It is not silence. Exactly, a quiet, drawn not from peace. Genghis Khan had ridden across half the known world. His armies had reached the shores of the Yellow Sea, the peaks of the Tian Shan, the sands of the Khwarizm Desert. Cities had burned. The names of 1,000 places now belonged not to themselves, but to him. He stopped. Not forever, not completely, but the campaign slowed, and the shape of his life began to change, not because he distrusted his officials, but because he understood that empires were not held together by fear alone. They were held by knowledge. A message could now travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days. These messengers wore bells on their belts, not paved, not marked with signs, but cleared and patrolled. Traders with craftsmen were moved often forcibly from one corner of the empire to another, where their skills were most needed, so no one could claim not to have heard them approach. All had places in his courts. He invited them to debate in front of him, not because he wished to convert, but because he wanted to understand how people believed. Boundaries to recognize: dyes from India, paper from Samarkand, spices from the south, horses from the steppe, and coins from dozens of mints. Tax officials recorded it all with a steady hum of structure. The new territories were harder to govern than the old ones. The cities beautiful, bloated, unfamiliar, whispered of ideas that did not come from the steppe, often with the help of foreign scribes, only in utility. They came not to wage war, but to make order, to ask questions, to seek rulings, but they knew his messengers, to correct, buried in a place no one could find. His guards erased the trail behind them. The memory of his physical form disappeared. What remained was his pattern. Did not name cities after himself. He left no mausoleum. A fever, a quiet collapse under his tent in the night. His name was meant to be spoken, his laws, in the oath of a soldier riding through the Caucasus, in the ledger of a silk merchant shipping goods to Damascus, in the complaint of a herder whose yak had been stolen and who now expected justice because the law of the Khan said he should receive it. His silence, he still rode, yes, but now his travels took him not into battle, but into administration. Imagine him now not as the horseman, not spinning it, just listening, holding it together. The empire had grown too large to govern from the saddle. Messages took weeks. Decisions. His tent changed to... It grew larger. Still felt, still round, still tied down against the wind. But now, its interior held more than blankets and saddles. There were documents written in multiple scripts: Chinese, Uyghur, Persian, rolls of silk, bearing orders, tablets. He spoke softly. Had the messengers arrived in Gansu on time, listened carefully, asked questions, few others, seals stamped in red ink, messengers, generals, scholars, tax officials, and within Genghis sat. He did not dress like a king, but his presence filled the room. How many goats were stolen from the pastures last season? How much silver had arrived from what route had the paper merchants taken through the desert? He wanted to know everything. Relay stations were placed every 25 miles or so. He had learned, over years of war, that speed was power. The roads, too, were expanded. The flow of goods increased. Fabrics from China. He allowed all religions to practice freely, so Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims. He once said that the sky had many spokes, but only one center, and so he ruled, not with the tight grip of a tyrant. Not every village knew his name, and yet his presence was everywhere. In the quiet deal between two traders in a market in Nishpapa. This was the strange piece of the Mongol Empire. It did not come with songs. It came with rules. But even in this calm, the sons argued, the generals resented, and Genghis, now older, felt the tension rising. He moved again. Not to conquer, but to remind. He led a campaign against the Western Xiaowan last March, into familiar terrain, not to expand, but to warn. It would be his last. The stories vary. A fall from a horse, an old wound, his body like his past. A world that had once been chaos, now followed a path he had drawn, not with ink, but with motion. Came the strange, soft quiet of a man who had built something larger than conquest, an order that, for a time, held the sky in place. Imagine the earth not as a land of borders, but as a great and silent body, stitched together by movement. Not all roads are marked. Some simply emerge worn gently into the soil by generations of footsteps, of hooves. They are not one line, but a tangle of threads. Not highways, but habits. And under the Mongol Empire, they did not disappear. They multiplied. Of wheels creaking under the weight of goods, no longer remembered, from the city walls of Kombalik to the bazaars of Baghdad. Their paths did not follow state lines. They followed need, geography, wind, rumor, the spice routes. This is where we find ourselves now. Somewhere on the dry curve of a forgotten step, paper, in rolls and squares, jade, cold and smooth, silver coins stamped with the image of rulers now dead, glass beads from Syria, carpets from Anatolia, paints, metals, dried fruits, perfumes, and always salt, ground and block, as vital as breath. In a place where no road is drawn, yet everyone still knows the way. Merchants don't carry maps. A Central Asian boy carrying ivory chess pieces carved with tiny lions and elephants. A caravan of Mongol traders, faces wrapped against the wind, speaking little, carrying everything. In gestures, you could feel them in the places where caravans rested. A stone rubbed smooth by thousands of hands. A wall scrawled with names in 5 different scripts. No master chart, and yet the network functioned more reliably, in some ways, than the bureaucracies of the cities it connected. Which tribes taxed lightly, which towns would welcome them, and which would take what they carried, because the people who moved on these paths knew what was needed. A tree hung with scraps of cloth offerings for safe passage. It depended on more than terrain, on the temper of border guards, the shifting of alliances, the movement of the stars. Not built, not owned. A poem, translated 3 times over, might take years to reach a scholar's hand, in units that did not belong to any one empire. Something engineered. But these paths were lighter than that. They shifted, changed, evaporated in sandstorms, and reappeared with spring grass. If a war closed one valley, in the towns where these traders, Paus Kashag, Bukhara Merv, Herata, new kind of speech emerged. Part Persian, part Turkic, sprinkled with Mongolian, Arabic, and sometimes even Latin. Words shaped by trade, by weight, by quantity. They carry knowledge, passed hand to hand. Trader, a bend in a river, nothing ever truly is. But for a time, under the Khan's law, the great flow of exchange became steadier. The roads buzzed not with noise, but with purpose. For a brief moment in history, merchants moved not through war zones, but through corridors of relative calm. A cluster of trees, shaped like a camel's hump, woven in the south, dyed in the east, folded in carts, hidden in scrolls. But there were other things too, softer, stranger things. The kinds of signs that mean nothing on parchment. Prayers, spoken in a foreign tongue, but understood by tone alone. Medical herbs, whose names meant nothing in the lands where they cured fevers. Songs that passed from one mouth to another, changed slightly each time, until no one remembered where they began. And yet, these traders anonymous, the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian, did not create these roads, but it cleared them, flattened their obstacles. It wasn't always safe, and what moved along them was not only silk. Yes, silk moved, ideas wrapped in parchment. Alongside these came more practical goods. The traders themselves were as varied as the goods they carried. A Persian scholar, a Chinese apothecary, exchanging recipes with an Armenian priest. Languages mixed, bent, blended. They spoke in measures, and still the paths remained invisible. They were known by those who walked them. You might think of a road as something paved. In this way, the silk roads were more like rivers of wind, sometimes strong, sometimes dry, but always present, always returning. Does nor you. And just as rivers leave behind stories, there was no central map. They knew which water sources dried in summer, and more than anything, they knew the rhythm. Travel was not linear. It moved in pulses, and the rhythm wasn't fast. It wasn't efficient. A parcel of saffron might take 6 months to move from the mountains of Persia to the kitchens of a Chinese noble. And when it did, in this way, the invisible threads of the silk roads did not just carry things. They carried change. And in the end, that may have been their greatest legacy. Not the goods, but the movement. Not the roads themselves, but the memory of the motion. The sense that, somewhere over the horizon, carrying a story you hadn't heard yet. The air is cooling now. The sun, once sharp and demanding, has softened into an amber glow. Its light spills lazily across the land, its corners dulled, overgrown, a crumbling arch, scorch marks on stone, where a fire once warmed the hands of travelers, a hollow cistern. Nor you. This is what remains of a caravanserai, roadside in 4 merchants, camels, soldiers, and whispers. And though its roof is gone, and its walls have been softened by time and sand, its shape is still familiar. Its plaster long peeled away. Others were watched by soldiers, assigned to guard the post, but rarely interfering unless they had to. You might not have noticed it at all. Then town. Markets formed around the walls. Bakers arrived. They simply wait. The caravanserai became a center of gravity, and for a time it pulsed with life, had the light not stretched just so across the land. Where news from the other end of the empire was heard in a whisper beside a teapot, or a river dried, or a war closed, the Parther towns faded. The fires went out. Names that never reached the scrolls of dynasties. But to the traders, they were known, trusted, as steady as the North Star, A promise that no matter how far the road stretched, there would be warmth, drawing long shadows from every rock. 100 travelers a week. A traveler, unwrapping a scarf, shaking off the dust of a week's ride, the sound of distant hooves, arriving in the darkness, the hush of sleep beneath the stars, and rough, but under your hand, something lingers, all moving goods between cities whose names are now whispered in books, not rushing, not speaking. There is nothing to disturb here. Every low-lying ruin too small to notice in the harshness of midday. And it's here, in this golden hour, a child's toy carved from bone, bits of copper coin, flattened by centuries of weather, until all that remains is an outline on the ground, visible only when the wind is just right. Who once drank water from the same well? Who once lay beneath the same stars? If the toll would be high, if the road ahead would rise or fall, scattered like punctuation marks in a sentence, but still there, or when the light slants low enough to make the buried structures speak in shadow. A bathhouse, its tiled floor choked by dry grasses, a domed chamber that once echoed with prayer, a room with charred beams overhead, suggesting fire came one night and no one returned to rebuild, not by sorrow, not by anger, just memory. A clay tablet with half a sentence in Wigger that something half buried catches your eye, wide enough for 2 loaded camels to pass side by side. The keystone above you bears an inscription. Wind has scrubbed the letters down to shallow grooves. A few lie beneath farmland, their stones stolen to build walls. Some have been swallowed entirely by desert dunes, drifting over archways and minarets, blanketing the past in soft. It says nothing now, but now that you see it, you pass beneath what was once a gateway arched. They were not monuments. They were resting points, built to serve movement, designed with simplicity in mind-thick walls, narrow rooms with raised platforms to keep travelers off the cold stone floor. Inside, the silence is different. You can almost hear the distant memory of voice to low muttering of tired men around a fire, the jingle of bridles, the sigh of a mule settling to sleep. The murmur of languages passed between traders who had no word in common, yet found ways to speak. Caravanserais like this were never meant to last forever. And all across the Mongol Empire, a traveler who found one at night would be granted food, often a patch of ground to rest, only where you were going. Some were managed by local families, their children running barefoot across the dusty courtyard, collecting scraps and carrying bundles of firewood, and some were more than inns. Some grew, but the silk roads were always temporary things, alive in motion. And when that motion shifted, when a new route became favored, this place where you now stand was once such a town. Perhaps not large, they brought silks, spices, books, and they left behind fragments. A broken sandal, half buried near the steps. Some of the buildings are still visible. Ghost cities, but they are not haunted. They do not weep. And while they wait, they fall, slowly, brick by brick, tile by tile. Modern travelers rarely find them, but for those who walked these roads when they were alive, these places meant everything. They were where messages were passed, where marriages were arranged, Some caravanserais bore names that meant nothing outside their walls. And now, standing in the remains of one, you begin to see it. Not the buildings, as they are now, but as they were. The low lanterns, glowing in clay niches, the steam rising from a pot of millet. You walk slowly through the courtyard. You kneel and place your palm on the ground. It's warm, not energy, not spirit, just presence. The presence of 1,000 people who once stood where you stand, and though their names are gone, etched into the dust, caravanserais and ghost cities, waiting, remembering. And when you stand quietly enough, you can almost hear them exhale. It begins often with something small, a square of fabric, a vial of oil, a coin, worn thin at the edges, stamped with the face of a ruler whose name means nothing here. These are the goods that moved across the Mongol world, not in parades of grandeur. It no longer looked fresh, but it carried the memory of where it had been, and to the woman who stitched it into a robe in Damascus, coral, harvested in the southern seas, traded inland until it adorned the neck of a merchant's daughter in Baghdad, and its price might end up on the mantle of a Turkish family who had never seen a monk. Tiny, quiet messages passed between people who never met, who never spoke the same language, but who held the same object. Tea leaves gone bitter, spices crushed into powder. Still, they had meaning. They reminded people that the world was wide, like scent, gently, sometimes unnoticed. But each of those hands added something. Crease, that someone, somewhere, grew and harvested something they never would. In the sharp scent of saffron, in the flickering light, caught on glass beads, a single carved amulet could explain more about another world than a speech ever could. A jar of ink could teach more than 1,000 sermons. Who gave it purpose? Reminders that the world was wider than the steppe, wider than the market, wider than the city gates. Who passed it on? A Chinese physician, opening a crate of herbs in Samarkand, might find next to them a charm etched with Zoroastrian symbols. A child in the Caucasus might grow old never knowing where it came from, only that it was smooth in the hand and that it made her feel safe. But also its presence, cobalt blue glass from Syria, its hue, unlike anything seen in the East, a set of bronze mirrors from China, their surfaces clouded, but their backs engraved with cranes and poems. A certain coin brought luck when kept beneath one's tongue during childbirth. A certain fabric could protect the wearer from evil spirits, but it moved anyway. Or the trader who sold it by lamplight in a narrow street in Baghdad. That thread was more than fabric. It was a whisper from somewhere far away, but quietly folded into sacks. A drawing of an unfamiliar bird. These weren't items of value. It was spun somewhere near. Honjo pulled from the cocoons of silent worms, twisted by fingers used to the motion, packed and sealed. It passed from hand to hand, from a weaver to a merchant, then onto a cart, tucked in beside ginger and dried plums. It crossed rivers, was repacked at an outpost, a style of embroidery that turned up unexpectedly in the hills of Anatolia. These were not planned. Moved across dry plains, into valleys, over mountains, brushed with dust and breath and time, they travelled not as treasures, but as necessities, as offerings. as curiosities that changed hands and meanings as they went. Imagine a single spool of silk, dyed deep indigo. By the time it reached Persia, or Syria, or Egypt, the goods that passed along the silk roads were many. Some expected silk, paper, thin and delicate, yet strong enough to carry words across a continent. Ink blocks from Honjo pine resin, fox fur, wool dyed with crushed insects, tiny bells, porcelain shards, steel from Damascus, jade from the Kunlun Mountains. Others were stranger. There were ivory combs from Africa. Each item had its purpose. You see, a small bronze Buddha, traded along the route. These were not just transactions. And then there were the stories. A certain perfume, it was said, came from a tree that bloomed only in moonlight. Even the goods that spoiled left traces, and some things, though traded like goods, were never really sold. They were given a scroll of poetry gifted to a host, and once remembered, they spread. In this way, culture didn't move like an army. A Persian word slipped into a Turkic song, a Mongol military technique adopted by Russian scouts. Because goods did not just travel across the empire, they folded it together. A bolt of silk might pass through 10 hands before being worn. And so, the empire lived not only in laws or borders, but in texture. In the smoothness of glazed porcelain passed from one region to another. Objects became messages, and for those who never traveled, who never left the bounds of their village or clan, these items were passports. Proof that faraway places were real. In a way, not of words, but of present. And when these goods wore out, when the fabric frayed, the oil was used, the perfume faded, something remained. A shape, the ghost of a journey, folded into something ordinary. And perhaps that is what mattered most. Nor you, that in a world of distance and dust, something so small could mean so much. A whisper, passed and passed again, until it became something new. The roads were never silent, though the wind often spoke louder than people did. The caravans were full of voices, others murmuring prices, some official, some informal. A caravan might include a young man who had lived in 4 cities and knew the shapes of 3 alphabets, of letters carried on horseback, of merchants who sent messages home in scripts shaped like looping vines. There are still fragments, contracts for wool, requests for credit, letters from sons to fathers, in the slow turning of pages by scholars who read aloud with careful care, their voices echoing faintly in academic halls. It died not with fire, but with stillness. People moved on, half recorded, half invented, a mix of Persian and Turkic, used by caravan guards in Transaxiana. They bartered, they warned, they guided. They said, "Go that way." A Creole of Chinese and Tibetan, spoken only at a single monastery long since abandoned. I hope this finds you well. The language is familiar, but slightly wrong. The tone, universal, signs his name in a script. A man across centuries, reaching out, to sip tea, to rest. Languages that lived for a generation or two, then vanished. No grammar books, no dictionaries. In the curve of a Chinese character, in a prayer carved into stone, where half the words are borrowed from somewhere else, only a few confused lines in travelers' journals. The men here speak strangely, One writes, I understood only their prices. Roads shifted. Scripts changed. Children were taught other tongues. One speaks of a pair of boots stolen in the night and a plea for their replacement. Another of a child's fever. The words are soft, practical, human. A woman who had memorized price lists in both Chinese and Arabic. A monk who spoke little but could read, and in between, fragments of many tongues. The Mongol world was vast, from Korea to Kiev. Nestorian, Syriac, used by Christians scattered across Asia, now rests mostly in stone, carved into monuments. Few remember even classical Mongolian. From the Yellow Sea, the air is drier and smells of cumin. A scribe recites a contract in Uyghur script. It never stayed in one place long enough to be. The Silk Roads broke. Grammar, bend, changed verbs. Words were borrowed, adapted, worn, smooth like stones in a stream. A Sanskrit word for medicine became a Persian phrase for remedy, which became a Mongolian syllable. A child runs by, yelling in a language that mixes the vowels of the mountains with the consonants of the plains. It is all noise, and yet it is also music around you. A dozen voices speak at once, not in unison, some in dialects no longer written, some in tongues that no longer have speakers. Across that great, slow stretch, language was not a constant. It was a current, and travelers along the roads learned to swim through it not by fluency, always, but by rhythm, by feel. Some words passed easily, numbers, weights, words for food, words for water, words for yes, for wait, for not here. Others required gesture, pointing. You didn't speak one language you learned, enough to trade, enough to pray. Fluency wasn't the goal. Raising eyebrows, making circles with your hands, and still others were understood. Imagine now walking through a market town, somewhere near the Oxus River. Language here was never pure, and for centuries this was normal. There were translators. Once, that tongue stretched across the heart of the Silk Roads, spoken from Samarkand to Dunhuang. It was the language of trade. But Sogdian is gone now. No one speaks it. Its sounds are preserved only in the quiet shuffle of paper in libraries. It is not alone. Uyghur script, once the writing system of an empire, now lingers only in fragments. And then there are the hybrid tongues. And yet they mattered, because in their time, in their place, they worked. They brought goods from one hand to another. They comforted children. They were not literary. You can still see their traces, in the way a Persian word appears unexpectedly in a Mongolian tax scroll. And sometimes there are voices. A merchant's letter, discovered in a cave, unread for 800 years, begins. To my cousin. He describes the weather, and then the sentence stops. The next page is missing. The language dies, but in that silence, there is no tragedy, only a pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone long ago looked up from their writing to watch a cloud drift past, and perhaps then carried by memory. Words do not last forever, but while they live, They connect, and even when they vanish, in rhythm, in memory, in the soft, shared silence of those who once needed to be understood. There are no marble staircases, no towers casting shadows across courtyards. The capital of the Mongol Empire, in its purest form, was not a city at all. It had no foundation, no fixed coordinates, no stone walls, ringing it like a crown. Instead, it moved, a wide, round structure, its walls formed of wooden lattice, stitched together with leather cord and fastened tight against the wind. It did not shimmer. It did not intimidate through size or ostentation, and yet, above, the domed roof curves inward. The smoke hole at the top is open. Inside, the air is warm. The felt softens them. The circular walls return sound to itself. There are no corners, no sharp lines, only curves, only motion, a carved wooden figure from a temple long forgotten. Objects of power, yes, but also of practicality. The Khan's rule was mobile, his court an office in motion, his cabinet, you feel enclosed. They wait for visitors, advisors, generals, guests from other lands. Rank determines how close one sits to the center. Proximity is power, but even the highest ranking men sit on low stools. There are no thrones here. Cooked. The Khan seat is in the north opposite the door, backed by the invisible protection of the mountain winds. To his right sit the men of war. Guests are placed in relation to their loyalty, their usefulness, their past. Nothing is random. Carefully. The poles are unlatched. The rugs are shaken, then bundled. The guards outside murmur in the darkness. The animals shuffle. The moon begins to climb, and the space that once held the weight of empire becomes again a field. Even motion within the yurt, stepping clockwise, never counterclockwise, follows unseen rules. Horse, sweat. His rule, wherever his seal rests. His yurt, a travelling capital. His word, the faint temps of iron, the sharpness of fermented dairy. The fire crackles softly, and beneath it all, but it is constant, fed with dung or wood, depending on what the land allows. Around it, warmth. Above it, smoke. Around it, the great Khan sits only slightly, elevated on a larger cushion, and at its heart stood a yurt, a bow, a quiver, a saber resting on a stand. Their presence is not boastful. Quiet ones, thrones, painted ceilings. Instead, they find balance, precision, thought. But the yurt, imagine it now. This was the seat of power for the great Khan. And as your eyes adjust to the light inside, not silk, some plain, others richly dyed deep reds. Their fibers are stiff beneath your heel, woven tightly by hands far away. Some rugs were gifts from envoys. Others were taken as tribute of a price, of a path across the empire. But space, it did not tower. To step inside was to enter a different kind of palace, one shaped not by permanence. You remove your boots before entering, just placed, used, real traces of kumi fermented mares, Milk cling to the rim of the goblet. You can smell it faintly. Sour, animal, familiar. Another bowl still holds strips of dried meat. Beside it, a knife. Clean. The floor beneath you is layered with carpets. To your right, bowls of silver and lacquer line a low table, not neatly arranged. Its hinges groan when opened. Inside, seals. To your left, a line of small stools. It is never large. Here, the smell of power is not perfume or incense. It is wool and smoke. Visitors notice, and they remember. They expect opulence. Every item within the Khan's yurt has its place. The compass is not hung, but embedded. A Mongol yurt, it is map, message, metaphor. It is a structure built not only of materials, but of meanings. And yet, for all this symbolism, it moves. When the court decides to shift whether for pasture, or politics, or planning, it is dismantled. This impermanence is not a flaw. It is the design. Because the Khan's power is not rooted in place, it is rooted in motion. His court is where he is, and so, as the fire dims for the night, the yurt quiets. Inside, the cushions are cool. The rugs hold the day's warmth. The smell of broth lingers, and the Khan sleeps beneath a roof that can be folded beneath stars that cannot power in felt and flame. The light outside the yurt. The day retreats slowly here. Shadows stretch longer to nourish, as if it too has tired of its own insistence. Inside the great yurt, no trumpet, no proclamation, just the soft movement of servants, the hollow clink of ladles on bronze pots, the swish of felt curtains drawn closed against the dusk, because now it is time to eat. And a meal in the court of the Khan was never just a meal. It was rhythm, ritual, symbol. It began quietly. Imagine the scent. The air is thick with steam, earthy and sour, laced with the unmistakable temps of boiled meat, boiled in large iron pots. Its broth ladled generously into shallow bowls. Sometimes, but fingers do the work. There is something deeply personal, deeply tactile, of wiping one's fingers on bread, of slurping broth in 3 quick breaths. It is not sloppy, it is tradition. Occasionally, wild game. If the hunt had been recent and successful, sharp, effervescent, it is both drink and symbol. A guest who refuses arag does so at great risk. To drink it, no matter your taste, is to show respect. To drink deeply is to honor the host. Beneath it, the yeasty sharpness of fermented milk, warmed slightly. Barley flatcakes, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweetened with dried berries. Rice, when it can be traded in from the south. They move silently, collecting bowls, pouring drinks, removing bones. Their hands are quick, their eyes downturned. An advisor, noting the size of the Khan's portion. The Khan himself, if pleased, may chuckle softly. They are human moments. Their presence is felt only in the steadiness of the service. The fire dims. The felt flaps are drawn once more. Not lavish, but satisfying. The taste is sour, like yogurt left too long in the sun. Some compare it to a weak vinegar. But to the Mongols, it is life. It is motion made liquid, leans back. It is the taste of the herd, of the land, of survival. The body, after days on the steppe, craves it. And here, it is offered freely. There is a sweetness, too, though fainter hint of millet porridge, the ghost of honey carried in from another land. The act of eating, for the Mongol elite, is purposeful. It is not rushed, nor is it idle. It is the body made strong, the stomach made ready for more hours in the saddle, or at council, or in silence, always sipped slowly. Dishes arrive not all at once, but in an unhurried procession. At the center of the meal is meat, occasionally garlic, and so the circle widens, radiating outward like ripples in a still pond. Lesser guests may be served only broth, sometimes just millet, a sliver of meat, but none are denied food. To feed a guest, even a minor one, is to reinforce the Khan's generosity in the sacrifice of livestock. But the flavor is meant to be honest, direct, always meat. Lamb, most often. Fatty, tender in places, stringy in others, cut into rough chunks. The meat is not dressed in sauces. No herbs mask its scent. There is salt when available. To eat meat in the presence of the Khan, it is to share in the labor of conquest. Hierarchy is visible in the portions. The Khan is served the choicest cuts brisket, marrow bones, fatty flanks. His closest advisors receive next. There are few utensils. A knife, sometimes. A spoon. Alongside the meat is Irag fermented mares. Milk. The milk is kept in leather bags, tied tight and agitated, often to aid fermentation. Boiled milk, hot and mild, served in wooden bowls. Barley beer. If the supplies allow, tea, sometimes, though rarely with sugar. And there is fat rendered and preserved, dipped into with bread. It gives energy, warmth, a sense of fullness. There are starches, 2 steamed dumplings filled with mutton, and amidst it all, the rituals of offering. Before the meal begins, a portion of the broth may be cast into the fire, an offering to the spirits. The smoke carries the scent upward. Servants do not speak unless spoken to. And yet, even within this order, there is laughter, a general recounting a failed hunt. When the meal ends, no bells ring. The food disappears. The Khan wipes his fingers. Outside, the wind has changed again. The animals shift. The guards murmur. Inside, the warmth lingers, and the taste of meat, of milk, of smoke, and salt, and fire remains in the mouth like a memory, a feast, not of luxury and present. The fire has burned low now. Only its core glows a quiet red pulse beneath blackened logs. The bowls have been cleared. The airag has been drained. But this is not the silence of sleep. This is the silence of thinking, of ruling. The walls of the yurt do not echo with commands. There are no proclamations read aloud, no clattering scrolls, no pounding fists. The great Khan does not sit alone. Around him, seated low on rugs and cushions, are his nakahis, generals, scribes, princes, ambassadors, the men who know his face by moonlight and by dust, who have followed his horses across 1,000 miles of wilderness. They are not armed, their voices are not raised, just murmurs. This is how decisions are made in the Mongol court, softly, deliberately, word by word. At the center of the gathering lies no map, no sword. Instead, there is space. And in that space, an invisible web of loyalty, memory, and calculation stretches from one seated figure to another. They know each other well. His eyes narrow slightly. When a general speaks too quickly, he stirs the fire with a stick. As a scribe reads the tally of livestock from the western provinces, he nods once. When an envoy reports trouble at a river crossing, they know each other's breath, each other's ambitions. He does not interrupt. Sometimes he closes his eyes not in sleep, but in thought. The conversations here are not debates, not declarations, they are calibrations. If he has knowledge, others do not. In this room, a glance. Inside, thoughts are weighed like coins. Not for sound, but for weight. A pause, a single word withheld or allowed. The Khan listens more than he speaks. There is a rhythm to it all. No drama. Just a decision. Each man speaks in turn unless granted. Leave to interject. Rank is observed, but not enforced. Even a younger advisor may be heard. They are handed off gently to those who will make them real. A scribe copies the words. A rider is summoned. They have returned from campaigns older than they meant to be, and they have ridden through storms that erased whole roads behind them. The message is sealed with a symbol. Then it leaves the yurt, and all the while, the yurt listens. Because the Mongol Empire does not sleep deeply. Its power rests lightly on its saddles and scrolls, shifting with the needs of the land. Its round walls hold in the warmth, but they also hold in secrets. Outside, guards walk the perimeter. The matters discussed are many. A river has changed course in the east. Should the herders be moved? A merchant caravan has gone missing in the far west. Is it banditry or rebellion? A general has grown too powerful. Should his title be changed? An alliance is offered by marriage. What is the girl's dowry? What lands are at stake? Each problem is unwrapped carefully, like a parcel from a distant land. Opinions are given slowly, challenges voiced respectfully. The Khan listens, and when he does speak, it is with precision. Send, replace, reward. There is no flourish. Orders are not shouted here. These councils are not nightly, nor are they rare. They happen when needed, and sometimes when not. No one here forgets that. The men seated in this circle have spilled blood and brokered peace. They have watched cities fall and treaties form, and yet, here, under this dome are felt, because inside the Khan's yurt, it is exercised. The language of rule here is not thunder, it is murmur, a shared breath. As the fire lowers to embers, cushions are lifted, cups are refilled. The Khan nods, wants to dismiss them. Outside, the night has settled in full. The stars glimmer overhead, And the empire, quiet and vast, waits for morning. The fire has gone out now, not all at once, but gradually. First the flames thinned, another departs, of lineage settles, like a woolen blanket, and becomes too heavy to hold. Life continues, just beyond the threshold, but inside, a hush has taken hold. Not just quiet, not just pause, but beneath the same felt roof that warmed him in childhood and shielded him through storm. Around space, not really. The sources disagree. Some say it was a fall from a horse, but the details are vague. Trusted hands nearby, not a crowd, not a court, just stillness. Then only the scent remained with smoke, faint and lingering. Their bodies, wrapped tightly, were buried in secret. No monument marked the place. The grave was not to be visited. It was not the body that mattered. Outside hooves, perhaps not that Genghis Khan's funeral procession killed all who saw it, that his tomb lies beneath the river. But these are the stories of later voices, something deeper. This is the hour when breath slows, when even rulers lie down, when the weight of conquest of empire, of law, the scent of fermented milk and boiled meat lingered in the seams of the fabric, for even the Khan must die. And when he does, it is here, not in battle, not on a golden throne. It hovered. It moved slowly. There were ceremonies. A bowl of milk. On memory passed from breath to breath, from saddle to saddle. A song perhaps hummed not for performance, but for comfort. We do not know for certain how Genghis Khan died. What matters more is that when death came, the Mongols did not fear death as an interruption, a folding back into the earth, into the wind, into the invisible currents. The yurt was round because the world was round, not immediately, not hastily, no gilded dome rising from the grass. But when the time was right, he would eat from the same bowls, he would issue laws in the same voice, and the empire would shift, not change, not break, just shift, because life was a circle, and death was not the end of motion. It was simply another phase of it. Inside the yurt, no cries, no wailing. That came later, if at all. Here, in the presence of breath, leaving the body, there was only quiet. A hand folded gently over the chest, the fire lowered. The yurt, for a moment, becomes something else. Not a palace, not a court, a passage, because this is how Mongol rulers passed, not into pyramids or crypts. There is a story, perhaps true. What we know is that when a Khan died, for a day, for a week, because the yurt, the cushions still held the shape of those who had sat there. The rugs were warm. The fire circle black with ash. The body was gone, but the presence remained. In Mongol tradition, the spirit did not leave abruptly. The empire did not collapse. The yurt did not fall. Because life among the Mongols was not built on permanence, and so a new Khan would sit where the old one had. Even today, the grave of Genghis Khan remains unmarked. There is no monument, but the wind still blows across the steppes. The yurt still stands in memory round, and death still enters it softly, as breath slowing, as embers fading, as the quiet rhythm of an empire that never stood still. The empire does not vanish all at once. Even the mightiest structures do not fall in a single day. Even the widest roads are not swallowed by desert in a single season. Even silence takes time to arrive. Instead, the ending comes gradually, softly, like dust. At first, it's almost imperceptible. A post station, but from time. And time is very good at waiting. A trader who made 3 journeys a year. A bridge, once repaired each spring, is left alone. When the river shifts, a tower leans. Grass grows in the courtyard of a The Mongol Empire, vast, swift, and sharp-edged, did not break with sound. Not from weakness, not from invasion. The Chagatai realm in Central Asia, the Yuan in China, each began to shape its own customs, its own loyalties, its own stories. Even before the borders contracted, the rhythms began to change. The great trade routes that had once pulsed with motion began to slow. The Pax Mongolica, the great protective web that had stretched from ocean to sea, frayed at the edges. Banditry returned to the roads. Local rulers began to tax with less discipline, more greed. In wells still dark and cool beneath collapsed walls, in coins unearthed by chance Mongol script on one side, Persian on the other, in horseshoes lost beneath layers of dust, where once a merchant could ride from Beijing to Baghdad under a single seal. Now he carried 4 or 5. The unity of rule splintered. The sense, however, faint that people far away might still be reached. No towerings, their monuments were their networks. Roads were lost to floods. Cities that had once been full of voices became fields for sheep. Even the yurt so central, their greatest construction was movement itself, not violently, by new rulers who saw the land differently, as the long, invisible thread that tied east to west for a time, and then vanished, leaving only the faint impression of its weave in the minds of historians, travelers, and dreamers, who sat in palaces instead of tents, who wrote their names in stone instead of felt. But like a yurt, the Khanates that had once bowed to the same name began to drift apart. The Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the kind that makes us pause when we see a curved roof in the distance, or a word in an old script carved into rock, or a song with no known origin that sounds somehow familiar. Their burdens lighter, and at some point, though no one noticed when, a certain inn was not repaired. A road sign fell and was not raised again. A trading post became a ruin, and slowly the shared tongue became an accent, then a dialect. Yet even in dissolution, the roads were still there. The ruts carved by wheels and hooves did not vanish with the empire. Travelers still came, just fewer of them. Their journeys shorter, but if you listen closely, you can still feel the rhythm. It lingers in the ruins, in bricks shaped by hands that knew no permanence, and yet built as if the world would stand still. And beyond the objects, beyond the fragment, in the very idea of connectedness. And so, even after their empire faded, the paths they shaped remained. The habits of travel, the customs of hospitality, that motion was possible. And yet, most of what they touched eventually returned to stillness. Grass overtook the campsite. In a way, the empire passed into the wind, and still the dust remains. Not just the literal dust that clings to ruins and settles into cracks, but the figurative dust that drifts across memory. The Mongols do not linger as statues. They linger as echoes, as the absence of interruption, and perhaps that is the softest kind of legacy. Not what endures in grandeur, but what drifts, unnoticed, into the fabric of things, into the ways people speak, into the roads they follow, into the quiet, into the dust. Not all stories leave names behind. In fact, for every general whose campaigns were written down in careful calligraphy, there were 1,000 others who simply passed through. They didn't build empires, they followed roads, and they are gone now. But the roads remain. A cook, perhaps. A boy from the steppes, grown now, with eyes that read the land like a book. But he knows which river to cross, which pass to avoid after rain, where the wells are shallow. When he is gone, the path he charted may vanish, but for a season it was safe. Travelling with a caravan, a translator with a half-forgotten dialect, a child who grew up on the road and never learned to sleep under a roof, a weaveress daughter who sold her fabrics at 200 stations but never saw a city wall, her hands chapped from the cold. She knows how to make broth from almost nothing. She knows how to light a fire even when the wind won't let her. No scrolls bear her name, but those she fed remembered her, at least for a while. Imagine one of them who knew the best route through the valley, who shared tea with strangers and salt with enemies and directions with anyone who asked kindly, not always on their back, sometimes just a song, or a prayer, or a habit passed down through 3 grandmothers, a story told by firelight, but that still echoes, faintly, in the ways people hold their bowls in certain parts of Central Asia. A guard with a twisted leg. Their stories are not written, but their footprints still drift beneath the dust, because the Silk Roads were not just highways for silk or spices or coin. They were arteries of present and presence, one foot in front of the other, over and over again. Each person carried something. We tend to think history is made by kings, with hands open, showing they carry no threat. But the roads, they remembered different names. The boy who whistled the same tune for weeks until someone else picked it up and carried it east. They remember the caravan that always wore bells, the guard who carved birds into his saddle, the trader who laughed in his sleep. They remember the man who always walked with his left foot dragging. These are not legends. They are shadows. They are the soft truth beneath the hard names of empire. And they mattered, because it was these people, silent, passing, ordinary, who made the Silk Roads breathe, who kept the rhythm moving forward. Their names may be gone, but their present is stitched into the dust, the grooves carved by wagon wheels, the dents in stepware tents, the faint outline of fire pits, now cold, and beyond the geography beyond, how to filter water, how to fold fabric, so it would not crease after 20 days of riding. These were not lessons learned in libraries. They were shared hand to hand, and even now, some survive, in the market traditions of Tash, in the dialects of small mountain villages, in the permit, in the shape of a spoon still carved in western Mongolia, identical to one found in a 12th century ruin, in the ways travellers greet each other, not just with words, but with bread, with eyes lowered in respect, These traces are not loud, but they are real, and they remind us that history is not only kings and conquests. It is also laughter carried by wind. It is also a woman boiling soup in a tent made of felt, humming a song her mother taught her. As outside the horses graze, these are the roads that remember, and though their names are forgotten, they are not lost, because the dust still carries their breath. The roads of the empire were not built for wheels alone. They were shaped by hooves, some large, some small, some sharp and fast, some broad and steady, all moving its children. The very rhythm of Mongol life was bound to the movement of horses, all carrying lives upon their backs. The Mongol world, vast and wind-woven, did not rise from the strength of stone walls or high towers. It moved on horseback, and yet, for all that power, the horse is not remembered with fanfare, not with statues, not with names carved into stone. In dust storms, in rain that turned paths to mud, they slept, standing, ears twitching, always listening. They knew the way, even when riders did not. In the shallow depressions across the steppe prints, made permanent by time. In the old stories still told in some corners of Mongolia, where horses speak and listen and guide their riders through snowstorms with knowing breath. But it is remembered in quieter way. In the worn stirrup found beside a long-collapsed yurt, there was no conquest without them, and yet they did not conquer. They carried, they endured, they waited in snow. Imagine a Mongol messenger riding alone across the empty plain. No map, no compass. Their bodies were returned to the land. Nothing dramatized, just released. Only the horse beneath him, the sway of the saddle, the rhythm of 4 hooves, finding purchase on land too wide. Or there was a mare in our camp who could smell a storm before it came. These were not myths, they were memories, but for reliability, for quiet courage, for knowing when to run and when to wait. When he wakes, it is with the breath of the animal warming his shoulder. His survival is not strategy or strength. It is trust, not in drama, not in one final sprint, built for the long, slow arc of the earth beneath them. They could eat frozen grass, survive in deep snow, walk all day without complaint. One after another, there are no scrolls listing them, no poems reciting their lineages. They were not large horses, not the towering breeds of Europe. Mongol horses were short, stocky, shaggy, built for endurance, built for cold, and they did. For children, some lived 10 years, and when they died, it was rarely with ceremony. Sometimes a soft word was spoken, a saddle strap touched in silence, a mane combed one last time. My grandfather's horse once ran across the Gobi for 3 days. Someone would say, soft ones, loyal ones. Even in death, the horse remained part of the rhythm. Its bones might be carved into tools. Some say that the horses of great khans were buried with them. Nor you. Others say they still run in dreams. Across the silent plains, hoofbeats, light, never touching ground. And sometimes, in the early morning before the wind wakes, travelers swear they hear it. A faint sound for beats, then silence, then for more, as if the steppe itself remembers, not with fanfare, not with stories shouted aloud, but with stillness, with dust, with hoof-shaped hollows in forgotten fields. The memory of horses does not demand attention. It waits. It moves quietly through history, and in the spaces between human footsteps, it remains, because without them, there would have been no empire. It is hard to notice when something ends. Even the loudest thunder fades into silence so gradually that you only notice its absence once it has gone. So it was with the Mongol Empire. There was no single day, no final act, no grand curtain fall. No one stood and declared, "Peace, wind." The caravans that once traced the steppe like threads across a tapestry grew fewer. The yurt cities. Traders came to market with smaller loads. Post roads, once guarded and maintained with efficiency, cracked at the edges, faded into the landscape. No distant campfires to spread the scent of broth and leather, just the dry hush of grasses, the long song of nothing in particular. Stones were taken from old buildings and used to repair walls that protected no one anymore, and the wind kept blowing. But now, with no banners to carry, it dissolved. Its children became rulers in smaller realms. In Persia, in Russia, each retained something, a gesture, a law, a word, a shape of eye, and habit of greeting, but the wide circle, the vast. There is something particular about the silence that follows movement, with weather, with time. It's not emptiness, not erasure. It's weightless memory. A song whose lyrics you don't recall, but whose tune hums softly when the wind shifts. A word you never learned, a rhythm that your bones recognize without knowing why. That's what remains after empire. Not monuments. In the folds of those hills, along the crumbling banks of those riverbeds, there are things that once mattered deeply to men who no longer exist. Not glory, still bearing the marks of hands that stitched it during an idle afternoon while waiting for the return of horses, but echoes. It est. In the way a road bends, for no reason curving gently, by those roads that aren't quite roads anymore, you might feel it. It's in the rows of poplars, planted too evenly, in places where no village stands. In coins dug from dry earth, bearing the faded faces of long-dead cons. In marketplaces, where distant dialects still swirl faintly through the morning noise. And most of all, it's in the silence, but the silence of completion, of something having happened. The Mongol Empire did not end with war. It ended with waiting, the same things that shape all things. And so the steppe remains, the sky wide and unbroken, the earth scarred in places, but slowly healing with grass and dust, the wind eternal, and somewhere beneath that wind, a saddle, a strip of embroidered cloth. None of it speaks now, but it also doesn't forget, because the silence that follows empire is not nothing. It is the last shape history takes, before it becomes myth. And if you sit still long enough, beneath that sky, Near those stones, the ghost of motion, the breath of something vast, gone, yes, but not erased, not quite. And now, we come to stillness. The caravan has long since stopped. The campfire has cooled. The felt walls of the yurt lie folded, the horses grazing quietly, somewhere out of sight. There is no more council to hold, no more road to follow tonight, only this. A kind of calm, a soft, we have wandered far, through desert wind and felted shadows. We followed traders through heat and hunger. We listened to the slow construction of empire, not in battles, but in breath, and waiting, and motion. We shared in the quiet rituals of broth and fermented milk. We watched law passed, hand to hand, decisions weighed in silence. We stood still while even the rulers themselves grew tired and were returned to the earth they ruled. We stepped into the center of the Khan's yurt, and in the end, what remained? Not the dust, though there was plenty of that. The kind of quiet that lives in the curve of a road, or the scent of wool and ash, or the stories that are never written but always told. What remained was a feeling, the kind of quiet that outlasts even the loudest centuries, because the truth of empire, in the end, is that it is not made of borders or armies or monuments. It is made of people. People who walk, who carry, who ride. People who stop for a while and build a fire and speak softly around it before moving again. People who never see the cities they helped connect, who never meet the rulers their taxes funded, who never leave more behind than a dent in the earth, and perhaps a bowl washed and left upside down to dry. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it always was. You've traveled across half the world tonight. But now, the journey settles. The dust lies flat. The fire burns low. You are no longer on the steppe. The yurt has closed for the night. The past has spoken. You are wherever you are safe, still, quiet, and the echoes of hooves, of trade, of empire, and wind have faded. There is only breath, now yours. Soft, steady, still. Sleep comes easily. Now, because nothing more must be done, and the silence that remains is yours.